And Kairu said, if the motto of your planet is act first, ask questions later, on odd-numbered days, you should swap places with that guy over there.
And Kairu said, in this one spot, shortcomings are no big deal.
And Kairu said, Interplanetary Math Lesson 107. A band of cannibalistic pygmies run into a herd of platform shoe salesmen. Neither group was ever heard from again.
And Kairu said, there's this one place that requires that all criticism go unsigned.
And Kairu said, in a more complex world, there's none of that cheap, petty crap you see around here. And even if there is, it's in a condensed version.
And Kairu said, the governmental structure on this one star is such that if you vote for a man, it is your right to later assassinate him. There is some talk of trying to export this notion.
And Kairu said, if you think you really heard them say you could pay later, your ears are severely landlocked.
And Kairu said, 3D intelligence has as its backdrop part of itself, and hence is partially blind.
And Kairu said, a guidance system with no tolerance won't take you anywhere you should want to go.
And Kairu said, over on this other world I saw, a static condition is not taken to be a solution to a problem.
And Kairu said, if you see the correctness of something, but it still doesn't help, you of course didn't actually see it, or you're 14 miles beyond help.
And Kairu said, knowing a difference in descriptions is nothing, but knowing a difference in usage is everything.
And Kairu said, the slogan on one growing planet was, don't reinvent the problem.
And Kairu said, most of what we see is invisible.
And Kairu said, in regards difficult to portray, life is almost as helpless as you.
And Kairu said, there's one voice that periodically reverberates about the universe which says, yeah, but life speaks so well of you.
And Kairu said, all human activity is biotic, and that's not is microbiotic.
And Kairu said, other than a problem with the goods, this one system only had two problems, service and service.
And Kairu said, If you're really going away, you don't have to go where you say you are.
And Kairut said, after apparently having a certain request granted, a guy looks out and says to the universe, I guess now I owe you. And the voice replied, you always owe me.
Look here. I figure let's go ahead and talk, because at the time we're taping this, it is into October, and I know, of course, many of you are suffering from whatever they call it, sunlight deprivation. I mean, it's obvious so many of us are acutely depressed. So let's just go ahead and talk. What seems to be the trickiness of doing whatever this is, of course it's tricky to even talk about it since I only say whatever this is, but then the actual trickiness, the quandaries, the dilemmas, the questions of trying to do this is not simply based on its unclassifiable spot in space, which, even though you perhaps have not analyzed it in that way, is quite properly any sort of even tacit premise you would have taken from the way I've talked about it and the ways that you should have thought about it in general, not as a collective audience. But to find it difficult, to say the least, to in some way to place this, like, well, what is it? And me refusing to put a name on it is just one little piece of that. Because if you begin to have some real feel in your own nervous system for it, you understand that there is really no name for it. It's not me being tricky. There is no name for it. And there is some validity in me pointing out that if you do name it, you've actually hurt it a little. Not that there is an it. You haven't hurt the thing. You haven't hurt me. And I'm not some part of some organization. This is no organization. So you haven't hurt the organization. What you've done is hurt your nervous system. It's like you've stumped your toe, that you're going along a certain way trying to set up new neural reactions, and you got distracted. You stepped on something. You had a blowout. But it's not simply that it's difficult to classify the spot in space. No, since you're all depressed, and it is getting cold weather, and of course, All Hallows Eve's coming up, and I know you want to dress up like regular people. I thought I'd go ahead and try to get you to consider it another way. It's not just the trickiness of classifying this in space. That is, what is this? What does this represent? What the hell am I up to? That's not the trickiness. The trickiness is this. It's actually untigable in time. The operations of energy, of whatever this is, does not actually function in a present. Not the present, because that would be local. Whatever this is, never, it cannot function in a present. That is the ultimate trickiness. All right, it's not the ultimate trickiness. It's the basic trickiness. Then, it's the middle trickiness. And, of course, if you progress, it's the ultimate trickiness. In our tapings of this, I have referred to people trying to do this as being, for a while, real revolutionists and then as real explorers. But even verbally, I can, if your nervous system is dancing along with the same general tune that I'm attempting to whistle in a key unknown, and of course I'm not actually whistling it now, remember, it's what makes it really tricky. That is, if you're listening right now, what it is you're hearing is off key, it's out of sync, you got the wrong words, and you very likely are using like a pentonic scale, and I might still be fooling around with a chromatic scale. But rather than verbally making references, even backhanded references, there is really a better map, and in which to extract even the appearance, even the probable, what you think you hear of the use of mankind, of saying a real revolutionist, that whoever was doing this would be a real revolutionist. A real revolutionist is still a spatial idea. And all the descriptions I used, and that nice model that Dana and Ben and some people made up, and the way I physically tried to get you, and I used it for a while, referring to the bushes and the city, and of course it's all metaphorical. But metaphors only exist in space. Metaphors cannot exist in time. And once you begin to see a little bit more, which some of you should see a lot before tonight's over unless I drop dead. A real revolutionist would be somebody living in the past. A real revolutionist is a spatial concept. A real explorer is a spatial concept. Don't feel like you're missing it yet because I hadn't got to the good part. But it is, and I could make it, and I assume you joined in. I'm not taking the credit for it. Well, sure I am, but you joined in. Of me calling it a real revolutionist, and the kind of activities. And then I went into referring to it as a real explorer. And it all made perfect sense, I assume, if you were listening at the times I was using such verbal picturizations, of somebody sailing away from the old country, and me comparing it to Magellan. And of course you understand it was a tropic reference, but of actually sailing away from the old land, the old parts of your own brain, off to new areas. That is still spatial. And you cannot sail away and do this spatially. You cannot rebel against this spatially. I'm going to give you a better description. And it takes out the figure of man instead of calling it a something. Of course, very simplistic and local versions of doing this kind of stuff has always been religions up until now. But they spatially, of course, put in there to say that somebody, if they're attempting to live a life according to the teachings of the Old Testament, they would be a Jew outside the cultural sense. Or if they were trying to follow the so-called teachings of a Jesus, they would be a Christian. That the human figure, what other way are you going to do it? If you're going to say that someone is attempting to do something, that there is a premise, that they're attempting to pursue some line of thinking, which on some real warm days when they're getting lots of sunlight, some of them like to believe, well, this may even lead to a change in my behavior. But it's always the figure of humanity in there. I'm going to give you a better one. Instead of referring to it as anything, with a human, with even the verbal appearance of humanity in the description, such as a real revolutionist, it would be better, if you can begin to follow it, that if I was going to make such a reference to somebody attempting to do this, instead of me referring to it as a somebody, it should be this three-word phrase. It should be in the future. That would replace everything. That would replace real revolutionist, somebody trying to do this, real explorer. It would replace anything. A location, it sounds like. A temporal location in the future. Blah, blah, blah. Instead of saying a real revolutionist would not do interviews. It would be in the future, people would not do interviews. The future I'm referring to is far outside the three-dimensional concept, but there's nothing of any misdirection to start off and just take that simple step and consider that I'm talking just about the future as the ordinary three-dimensional earthbound intelligence perceives it to be. That is, something, somewhere, somehow, just right beyond where we are right now. And of course, certainly beyond where we were previously. In the future is more, even verbally, representative of a more complex and a more universal plug-in spot for intelligence. Can anybody get a quick glimpse, when I say this, that almost everything that's ever been said, is being said, has ever been written, has ever been thought, is in the past, is the past? I don't mean just history. That everything that is being said, everything that's being thought about right now, everything that's being written, is in the past. Not just in some tricky verbal way that I might pull it out, which I tried to lay the groundwork for some of this many moons back, that I point out the electrical, chemical basis, several passing occasions, that of you actually hearing, for instance, us staying here conversing. Any two people, that what you hear me say is already in the past. Now, there's no doubt about that. Not only what I said can go no faster than on this level than the speed of sound, then you have got to be, if you're listening, you're stimulated by it, your brain chemically reacts to it, and what you're reacting to is already over. The more crude examples, in case any of you missed them in the past, was that somebody insults you, somebody flies by in a limousine. See, I changed it from a pickup truck. And they roll down the window of the limousine, and they holler out, as there you stand, an innocent, decent person in life, and they go whizzing by you, and they holler out, what insults have I never used? Hey, fatso. I'll go back to that one. And then they roll the window up, and you hear the sound of uproarious laughter just as the window closes. And you turn as quickly as your keen reactive skills, knowing you, having taken Taiwan or whatever it is, back in grammar school, you immediately whip into action and you holler, fuck you. The point is, you can hear this. This is simply a statement of everyday reality. The people in the car are no longer even laughing about you. They've already changed the subject. They had a big old laugh, and they turned to somebody else, and they said, you got any more crack? What time is it? You are reacting to something. You're hollering out a curse at the person. What the hell with your mother? And it's too late. Do you understand who you're hollering at in their own nervous system? You're now the past. I mean, they don't even remember. If a genie suddenly jumped into the limo and hollered, boy, you really hurt that guy's feelings, very likely they go, what guy? What guy? Back there, that guy you just hollered at. And then they might go, oh. They don't even remember what you look like. They wouldn't see you. And yet there you stand reacting to the past, although it was a split second. If you could get your curse, if this genie said, when you went by, you rolled up the window and you guys were laughing, I guess you heard it, but he said some dirty things about your mother. The person being insulted then, if they went, are you sure? Was not even, in the chemical operations of the brain, is not even the same person that hollered out, hey, fatso at you 15 seconds before. That is easy enough to see. Very difficult, may I agree with you, for ordinary intelligence to remember, much less to use. I am now trying to drag your attention into a much wider area that's not limited in any way to local examples. It is simply the fact that you are surrounded by that is not limited. I'll repeat one more time, so don't think that it's too simple or too complex, but it is not limited in any way. It is not definitive, even by my verbalization of it, to your ordinary conception of time and the future, and the past and the present. But it is almost impossible, under any conditions, ordinary conditions, to find anything, to be aware of anything going on that is not in and of the past. And you can stand, you can hold your head, you can squint, you can try anything you want to under ordinary conditions, which I'll admit to you, some of you, if you suspect, is part of the pleasure, the absolute pleasure of certain and a few other certain drugs. You cannot deal with anything with the ordinary nervous system that begins to resemble the future. And not living in the future intellectually makes you heavy, even if you're not fat. It makes you dense, even if your atomic structure is not out of the ordinary, if your mass is not that much out of line. You are trying to pull, ordinary people do not notice it in this way, but trying to do this, you are trying to pull the weight of the three-dimensional universe somewhere, and you don't know where. But you would normally think, if I use that description, that you're trying to pull it to a place, like you're trying to pull it up in your nervous system, or you're trying to pull it away from the flow of ordinary events. It's not in space, it's in time. This, whatever it is, whatever it's always been, this thing does not function anywhere in anything resembling right now. When it is functioning, and it doesn't function as a system, there's no organization to this, there is no system, there's no bunch of people doing this, not in some organized fashion. When it happens, it only happens in you. And when it happens, in all my descriptions of you have fired up the brain, that you've got new chemical patterns, all that's true enough. But here's what you're doing. Your nervous system then, your intellect, as ordinary people call it, is now gone past the present, because this does not operate, it cannot operate in the present. I'll repeat one more time. The present is not limited to your ordinary concept of it. But it does not operate, it cannot function. I mean, it's not open to debate. Trust me, until you see it. It is just as physical as if I dropped a cup and it hits the floor. You had no doubt as soon as I let go that it was going to hit the floor. It is that certain. You cannot do this in the present. Does that make it qualify, as I started out when I said the real trickiness of this? Does that qualify as tricky? That you can't do it right now when it is operating. It is not operating spatially. You haven't moved somewhere. You are, I'll go ahead and put it crudely, you are thinking in the future. That's what it amounts to. That's a little crude for my taste, but now I think about it, I got pretty goddamn crude taste. Anyway, you are thinking in the future. I'm going ahead and beat on this for a little bit because it'll slip up on some of you. You may think you hear it, or you may think you don't hear it, or you may think it's been so obvious that you heard it as soon as I started. Literature, music, art, philosophy, all of the institutions, all of the arts, sciences of humanity are the past. The classics, in the sense of whatever this is, in the sense of an intelligence that is freed from the confines of right now, the classics, the stuff that's fun to read, the stuff that has survived, that was necessary for some reason, life needed, the writings of Homer to survive. In other parts of the world, they've got literature 5,000 and 6,000 years old, traces of it. It needed to survive. And you might be able to read it now, and there seems to be a spark at times caused by reading this. But that stuff is as dead, it is as overweight, it is as rotten, insofar as doing this, as if they had comic books back in the days of Homer, assuming that comic books are less of a literary art form than the classical literature. I say that to take up for some of you people I see with those funny magazines in your pocket. Everything that is readily available, books, magazines, art, philosophy, people lecturing on anything, everything, and when I say readily available, I don't mean that there are things going on that's hidden from you. We're not worried about the transmission. It's the reception. When I say anything ordinarily going on, that is, if you're ordinary, anything that you'd go out and find. And if you thought, well, boy, Western civilization, assuming that you were from the Western world, the Western civilization has taken some sort of faux pas somewhere and we're on the wrong track, and you went somewhere else. That good old trek to find some sort of new information, to believe that for some reason that there are barefooted monks living in the Himalayas that in some way have gone far beyond the computer age, and you go over there and sure enough that they are guarding with their life little brown writing manuscripts of thousands of years ago that they're repeating over and over and over. That yes, this is progress. This is what I've been looking for. It as dead as anything that you could imagine. It is inoperative. It is necessary for life. There is nothing that you can perceive, whether you went there, whether you walked down the street, no matter what book you get, if you learned a whole new language so that you could read something from 720 in the original Mandarin, you would still receive that which is the past. It is not the problem. It is not a question of reception, of transmission going on somewhere of which you're unaware. It's all the past. And if it's the past, it's not this, whatever this is. Because this, when it functions, is not functioning in the present, in any present, in a present. If you are functioning in a present, which is your present, you're still dealing with local reality. You're dealing with data. It can be shifted around, but it will never expand. Humans would not be what they are if they could not think of the future. It's easy enough to be aware that on this planet, everything of which you can be sensually aware, that humans are the only ones that can perceive of a future. But that is no assurance that you can live there. It is certainly no assurance that you can think there. And yet people, if I put it to them that way, intelligent people say, well, that's a crop. Because I can. What are plans except thinking in the future? It's a beautiful arrangement. Man would not be serving the purpose he is. Man would not be what he is could he not think of a future. And by being able to think of a future, he can say, well, by being able to think of a future, I can think of the future. I can think futuristically. I can think outside of where I am now. I can project what I'll be doing tomorrow. I can try to project what my company, what my interests will be, where I'm headed through my efforts and my discipline, where I will be 6 months from now, that I am thinking in the future. I guess that's pretty intelligent for me to stand here for seconds and go like I'll win over a mass audience by going, no, 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 no. But there are magazines, there's even a discipline called, well, There's been a show, been on radio, it's on television now. There's, I guess, of small interest, but the name of the show is The World Tomorrow. And that thing has been on as long as I've been alive. And some of you may have seen it. It's gone through several hands of a father and son, and now it's fallen into somebody else's hands. The World Tomorrow. And the show has always been, it's based upon biblical theories. Think about it. Now, ordinary intelligence wouldn't find that strange. You don't have to be a supporter of that guy's religion. So we're not just laughing at that, but it's the world tomorrow. You can take that. But it's based upon this church's, or this cult's, interpretations of biblical stuff of, all right, here's what's going to happen. That is taken as being predictions, in this case, religiously based predictions. Do any of you smell anything before I press on and try to beat you into the ground with this tonight? These so-called predictions have got nothing to do with the future. That's not what I'm talking about. That is not what the future is outside the realm and the weight of 3D thinking. There is no such thing as a futuristic prediction. If in some way you're tied to something that's not the future. Well, I was going to say they're magazines that surely many of you people know. They're magazines that refer to themselves in various ways as being futuristic. There are even schools of philosophy. There were schools of art going on for a while called futuristic. But there are contemporary periodicals and organizations right now. I was thinking about some magazines that are, whatever their names are, but are talking about themselves being futuristic. And you look through the magazines and they're almost entirely taken up by bibliographies, interviews with the founders of, as far as that one publication, the founders of this particular futuristic movement. Which, if you're ordinary and you're interested in such things, by whatever name it is, but it's futurism, like where we're going with computers and artificial intelligence, but it's, let's just call it the futuristic movement. And you may look at the magazine, and there it is for sale, and it says interviews with Sam Futuristic and Brenda Futuristic. You think, God, some of my favorite people. And you pick it up, what are you doing? It's no attack on you, it's no attack on humanity, but you think, God, it's an expensive magazine, but I don't mind. This is my one field of interest. To be able to actually read Sam Futuristic, and they interview him. And it even says, the most intimate, personal interview that Sam has ever granted. And you pay your money and you go, and he talks about his childhood. He talks about how he wrote his first book and how surprised he was that it became popular. And some of the drawbacks he's had. So you hear it all. This is not any kind of criticism of life. It is almost impossible for ordinary intelligence to even hear what I'm talking about. Because the ordinary intelligence is already wired up to deny what I'm saying. For me to say that you cannot think in the future, because you can think about the future. And so if I say, well, you cannot think in the future, ordinary intelligence says, you know, you're nuts. I can do it right this second. I can just do it anytime I want to. I do it a lot. I do it a lot without even thinking about it. They even specifically try the Futuristic Movement magazine. And that's what it is. It's the history of the movement. It's people telling what happened to the movement. It's people attacking outsiders for what they did at our last convention 2 months ago, the way they picketed us. Somebody broke in, and one magazine had some famous futuristic science fiction or computer whiz, some combination of all of it. It was a big deal that they had an interview with him, and one of the outstanding statements evidently they thought he made, because it was like the head of the page and it was down the body of the interview, was after he talked about his past and all that happened. And of course he talked about some of his plans, a new book he was working on. I'll try again. Does anybody understand? That's not thinking the future. But it sounds like, well, he's giving you an inside. Well, right now I'm working on a brand new novel. The working title is such and such, and I'm up to chapter 6. Like I'm in on something. You're in on a graveyard. You're in on the present, which is the past. But at any rate, this particular famous futuristic writer, this author, went to great pains to point out how excited he was that the computer technology of our day had reached the point that he could now take all of his works and get them on one laser disc, so that from now on he can continually refer back to his own work, see how he was doing, how he progressed, see when he did so and so. The interviewer didn't notice it. He certainly didn't notice it. This is a living, famous, contemporary, futuristic thinker. It's not his fault. Because what I want you to see, to be charitable about this, with ordinary intelligence, it is almost impossible. Of course, I've already blew it by saying it is impossible. But it's almost impossible to make your brain think in the future. Because it can think about the future, and that's the end of it. It won't go any further. Not that it could, but it won't even look any further. It'll just dismiss this, which is the way it's supposed to, because you have reached the edge of the three-dimensional universe. You have reached the edge. Don't worry about spatially. I may be referring to something else, but don't worry that I'm saying the edge of the universe, because you can assume it for the time being. I'm just being metaphorically melodramatic. But you have certainly reached the edge of your thinking universe. You have reached literally the edge of where you think. And I say you cannot think in the future. In order to intelligence, get right up the edge of there and think about the future. And so you're crazy. Because I can, and you can't. But plus, it's almost impossible to have the slightest awareness. I shouldn't beat around the bush. There's no such thing as slightest awareness. It can't do it. Let me stay on some of the contemporary examples I've just got some passing knowledge of, but this kind of futuristic, the heart of it right now, circa 1989, seems to be tied around dreams of artificial intelligence and all kinds of subcultures of computer hackers and even new drugs that they're coming up or renaming, reformulating. Anyway, all this it's always been around, but right now I'm just happening now to become aware of some of these publications. But they're contemporary organizations, and I'm still just going to lump them under futuristic movements. And they even take pains to point out how uncomfortable it is in a way to think about the future. But these famous people writing, they do it sort of like, well, somebody has to do it, and a few of us have to shoulder the burden, but those of you who just read our writings, or some of you peons out there, even you can experience some of the kind of stress to try and think about the future, much less to try and live in the future. And life won't allow anyone, intelligence won't go that far, to bypass all that and to point out how not uncomfortable it is, how impossible it is. Not only impossible to live there, but impossible to think there. Think about there, but not think there. I'm not going to drag up examples historically to try and prove anything, but I can see the difficulty here and I can sense it out there on tape. Any figure that I'll leave it blank, that you think has had some intellectual, try to leave it there. Forget about the mythological stories of how they met some messy end, or the state turned on them, or their peers tried to drive them away. Look at it as an intellectual impact that certain figures seem to have had in history. What was it that they said that seemed to be so startling, spatially? Nothing. what was startling, if it was at that time, what was startling was what they were talking about, for someone to hear it for a split second. That is, for the transmission went out from this apparent person. Anyone who received it and heard anything resembling what was transmitted was carried literally into the future. Forget, I'm not even going to tell you how far in the future. That's not even of any consequence. Well, even if it is, you couldn't hear it, because you got to be able to hear this first, and if you do, then it's another story. What they said, if you receive some of it, was not just an altered chemical pleasure in your own brain, which it was that, but when it is this apparent other kind of intelligence that happens, your intellect is functioning no longer in the present. That's what happens. That's why the words are of no consequence. That's why the words, after the fact, you go back and read somebody that apparently just changed the course of history, or some large segment of this planet's history was changed by this person. You go back and read it, and I'm not denying that people can read some of this and go, wow, God, that's heavy. But if you go back and try to read it with a certain kind of attempted detachment and just look and try and sensually feel it the best you can, is what is the nature of this? How did this spatially move people that they had such an effect? Nothing. Even when it seems to have an effect, even when it seems to have an effect, like people will say that I almost smell something of great significance. I can almost feel how it must have been to have been standing there 2,500 years ago, 3,000 years ago, when he said that, when he made this kind of speech. I can almost feel it. What you're saying is, I feel as though I can almost get outside thinking right now. That's it. And you also, the suspicion that there was something more going on there. And then, of course, it leads into suspicions that the people were supermen, or they were fractions of God, that he let part of the equation fall out of the heavens or off Mount Olympus. But what you are smelling when people do that also is, if I could hear that, I suspect that there's a transmission that went on, or maybe going on now. And if I could hear closer to what I suspect, I don't know what, but I just feel that there's something else. If I could do that, I would be somewhere else, not spatially. My thinking would be in the future. As vague, as difficult, as tricky as some of this may sound tonight, I assure you that it's not. This is about as plain as I can talk about certain things. It's just plain as hell. It's just literal. I don't have to put many conditions, or I'm not inclined to tonight. When this is operating, whatever this is, when it's operating in you, I don't mean me, I don't mean anybody else, any time in history, any other part of the planet. I'm talking about when something is operating in you, and it's not just the chemical pleasure of listening to this, at times when it just seems to be pleasurable. When it actually happens to you and you realize there is reality behind the kind of descriptions that I have put out about firing up the brain in places where it is not needed to operate presently. When it happens, it's all out of the question as to what the necessary or what the proper description, but then you understand what I and other people have pointed at. You then have your own reception of it, your own experience. But what is happening? Forget any kind of mysticism, and it's beyond simply a new chemical reaction, which it is. But what has happened is, intellectually, you are no longer in the present. That's as plain as I can put it. As strange as that may sound, or as spooky or as science fiction as that may sound, it is not. When this operates, it is not operating now. Because there's a limit to what can operate now. And now, by the way, is always the past. Not just theoretically, and not me just saying that it's relatively true because the guy you staying at the bus stop shouting back a curse at the guy that cursed you, and for me to say, all right, your now is his past. Yeah. I did that because you should be able to see it. It's not just relative between you and this speeding limo. You know, forget Einstein's moving trains floating in the universe. It's right here, staying there at the corner of Cherry and 14th Street. You've already got that kind of theory of relativity in demonstrative action, that the people that went by that hollered at you, "Hey, fatso," and you went, "Well, God damn you." The relativity theory in the 3D universe has already taken over. They are no longer inside your same universe. You're no longer in part of their universe. You are reacting to the past. All right, everybody can surely see that for a split second. But that's nothing. Anything that's possible for ordinary thinking. Don't take anything weird. Don't worry about terms of consciousness or some kind of unique spirituality. Thinking, that's all you got. That's the only thing you got that makes you any different than an orangutan. No offense to any orangutan, so don't write me. That's the only thing that makes you different. That's the only exceptional pleasure you get. That's the only reason you're doing this. There's nothing spiritual about this in any sense you understand. There's nothing mystical about this. There's obviously no cultism here. There's obviously a damn little organization to it. Almost no cohesiveness to it. Because for it to be some kind of cult or to be an organization, there's got to be a foot planted somewhere. That the organization, or if this was some kind of operation, it's got to be against something. Or at least every now and then they'll try to say we are for something, but then you find out what they're for is putting down these other people. All of that is dead. Even if you think about it now, it's the past. Anything that ordinary intelligence can do, anything that life allows to happen that you can think about under any ordinary conditions is dead. It is the past. That's it. It is not this. It will not give you what might be possible. It will not give you what some of you have already experienced. It will not give you without drugs some of that which some of you have had on drugs. Which notice I don't go around constantly knocking drugs. But it won't do you any good because many of you have had experiences that are very close to what I'm talking about. There's no secret about that. They've been around for years and years and years. But anybody that believes that I'm going to get in the future by drugs, you might as well believe I'm going to get in the future by joining a futuristic organization. Or by reading some more interviews by these people that won't tell you about their past. And what a hard time it's been for me to be a futurist and be able to think in the future because it's very uncomfortable and a lot of my friends don't like it, and I have to really take, I'm going to tell you the truth, I have to take real chances. I run the risk of being ridiculed even by some of my own peers to fly out here with some of my great theories. It's bullshit. It's just as dead. And I have to fight this all the time with doing this. Because anything I tell you is already dead. Even though it may sound right in many of you, which is part of the procedure, but many of you take notes. And I can see you, I'll say something, a phrase will come out, and you go, God, that hits it. That hits it not just on the head of some social critique, but that hits it in a way that I never thought, oh, I can use that. It's so far beyond that. Not spatially. Not spatially. That's why this is no kind of course. It's not something you join up and, well, maybe if you work on this 20 years. 20 years is not time in the three-dimensional world. 20 years is space. It's saying that you are somewhere, and by sticking with me, by sticking with this organization, we can move you from here, from being this, just run-of-the-mill dumbass, over here to be a superior person. It can't be done. You can be moved from here to the graveyard, which is an improvement. That's not as sarcastic as some of you may think. I may not be sarcastic. You cannot be moved anywhere in space. That is not what this is about. That's why it can't really be described. And that's why anybody that describes it doesn't know what they're doing. Which is not of any particular importance, but it's not to protect you from W.C. Field clones dressed up as gurus or something. It's really to protect you from your own nervous system. Because temporally speaking, there is no distance between you and everybody else's nervous system. If there is, you would still be locked into the same kind of thinking mode as the grandparents' part of your own nervous system to believe that in some way you've been driven from the gods, which is just a way of saying that you have been driven from the center of information, that you were not thrown from physical paradise, you were not driven from the Garden of Eden. But that feeling is that I have in some way spatially been removed from information central. which is what local intelligence is. And local intelligence is the only kind of intelligence that's available where? Locally. No, when? Locally. Now you got it. See, local is not a place. I just say on this planet sometimes, I say here. But here is not here. Here is where? Here is what? When? That wasn't that tricky. Well, let me try a little bit more. It's right here, not where I'm gesturing, not in me, not in somebody else. It's in here, and you're wanting new information. All attempts to change, even by ordinary people, which this is not about ordinary people, this is not a charity, this is not a do-good organization of any kind, since it's not even an organization, but if it was, you should know that by now. But even in the ordinary world, people wanting to change, everything from lose weight to improve their education to move up in the social world. All of that is a desire to get closer to parts of your nervous system that are still your grandparents. They would say things, they want to return to the Godhead, or they want to get closer to the, if your grandparents had been more free thinkers than Baptists or Presbyterians, I guess they would say they want to get closer to cosmic forces and goodness. If physicists had some sort of underground religion, I guess they'd be saying that what it is driving us, it's not just to win a Nobel, it's not just to be a famous author, and it's not just to slate my curiosity. What I really want to do is to some way myself and my own thinking, which is the only thing that matters, is I would like to get back, assuming the theory is correct, to the second right after the Big Bang. That is when I would be right there intellectually, I would be at Information Central. I would be at the core of the universe before it went like this and shot us all out. Not into just planets, but into planetary intelligence. That is local intelligence. And now all I got's a piece. People wanting to lose weight are trying to get back to the Big Bang, to the second right after. They might say to the Big Bang, but if they thought about it for a second, they'd realize they don't want to go that far. You want to get right back. Just, in other words, everybody'd like to get into the king's room, into the court, and then into the private chamber, maybe get close enough to kiss his ring or to tell you, your name so he could remember. But nobody actually wants to sit in his lap. You know what I mean? Because you might make a rude noise or something, and he's going to have you killed. So people do not actually want to get back to the Big Bang. They want to get back just right after it happened. People do not want to, even those that believe that there's some kind of, they're on the trail or they're on some journey of being a metaphysical scholar, a student. They say things like, I want to go back and rejoin the Godhead. They don't actually want to do that. They want to get just 1 inch, 1 second before that. Because they got back part of the Godhead, they disappear, using their descriptions. It's like, boy, these kind of mushrooms are so good, and you keep taking them, they get better and better, but when they get so good, what happens? You go, and you wake up and you think, God, did I do good? Was my consciousness expanded again? Did I actually think what I dreamed I think, or was I dreaming that I was thinking what I was dreaming that I thought? Oh, damn, I took too many. So you want to take just enough, but in the 3D world, you've always got to take just one more, or it's not enough. If it's not abused, it's not properly used. That is, you've always got to go one step further. Now back to what I was going to try again and point out. It is not spatial. It is not of going one step further. It's part of the trickiness of this. Because you can beat your head on a wall, you can beat your feet on this planet by trekking here and there, by reading anything you want to, by listening to anything you want to, and it can seem to transport you in some way spatially. That is, it can seem to rearrange the chemical way in which you think. That you might go somewhere and there seems to be, explained any way you wanted to. It seems to be the music, the charisma of the speaker, the humidity of the place, and all the people cheering along, that you apparently can leave after you heard somebody making some statement about the nature of reality or how humans should change the way they operate or how they think. And you could leave and say, well, this thing has been mind, maybe life-altering to me, because I do not think exactly the way I did when I walked in there 2 hours ago. that apparently you have been moved. You have apparently changed your mind. You've changed it spatially. But those really involved with whatever this kind of activity have been can go through that very easily, very simply, and should have done so very quickly, temporarily at an early age, and without becoming too cynical. Is go through like 3 or 4 religions, 5 or 600 books maybe, 2,000 or 3,000 mind changes and following this and that. But when you do it right, most of you should have been able to do it in 6 or 8 months, maybe your freshman year in college, or those of you that are of a more Middle Eastern biblical turn, by the time you were 12. But you should have been through all that and realized, well, that was fun and so it was interesting, but that's not even close. I mean, I thought it was close for a second, for a minute, for 5 minutes. But I woke up and I was still itching. It's because this is not a spatial reality. The reality of this, I can't say assuming there is some, but I'll say there is some. No sense being coy all my life. The reality of it is not spatial. If you're waiting for this to exist and you're thinking now, it'll never happen. It will never, ever happen. It cannot function here. That's the trickiness of it. And so it's not me just being playful with words and me saying, well, this doesn't really describe it. I've tried to come very close to pointing out to you that there is a great fallacy in that. Because if it cannot be described, it cannot be described. And if it can be described, whatever was said was a description. That was the transmission. Now, whether you can receive, whether you can begin to receive, and you hear that everything that is transmitted from any source also is at least an indirect comment on something else, then you can move around spatially and expand what you hear. But when you actually are personally, internally experiencing whatever this is, when it is functioning, it is not functioning now. It cannot operate now. It simply doesn't exist now. It does not. I can guarantee you. You can't find it now. And any time that you find what seems to be it now, it's dead. That's why you can't find it in a book. That's why you can't get it from anybody. Because anybody you could get it from is already in the past. Let me get back closer to where I started before the runs out. If you'll just look around, if you'll start this, if you look around at life, you can begin, it's not a negative comment, but you can begin to sense how heavy and dead everything is. I'm talking about things that seem to be exciting. And that can be, there's nothing wrong with this. It might be something that you find as a secondary hobby, like go out to a ball game or go out to a disco. Well, maybe you shouldn't go that far. Disco's not dead, it's only sleeping. I think it was Stanley Brothers, wasn't that their famous song? Or Flat and Scruggs? Oh, that's Mother's not dead, she's only sleeping. Same with disco. If you will feel around, everything that's going on, even if it appears to be large numbers of people, and they're screaming and they're shouting, there's nothing wrong with that. Nothing wrong with a football game, nothing wrong with the milieu of a nightclub, nothing wrong with you being there if you enjoy it. But if you can begin to feel every bit of it, now that's another story below the nervous system line of the brain. And something else is why sex and food and shelter I have tried to get you to see as a kind of primary, non-verbally based reality of its own, and it is not simply locally. It becomes local insofar as it gets combined with thinking. But you can feel anything that humans think about, and you have to think about a ball game. You have to think about a nightclub. It is a secondary activity. Even if you go there to get laid, to get into a primary mode, it is a secondary affair to go to a nightclub, to go out to a ball game. You can begin to feel that compared to, if you've had any experience involved with this before, you can begin to feel what I'm telling you. It's not heavy weighty in some pejorative sense. It is heavy and weighty in comparison to what is possible that you can think in the future. And when you can, the rest of this, all of it, no matter what it is, popes, rabbis, great rituals, no matter what it is, you understand is in the past, and it's all at the same level. And it cannot be scratched away. That is not where you itch. You do not itch in a place, you itch in a time. How's this? And speaking of time, we just ran out.